October 25th, 1415. Dawn broke over the muddy fields of northern France to reveal what should have been the easiest victory in the history of medieval warfare. 30,000 French knights, nobles, and men-at-arms, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, faced a starving, disease-ridden English army of perhaps 6,000 men who had marched 260 miles in 17 days through hostile territory. The French outnumbered them 5-1. They wore the best armour money could buy, plate steel that could turn aside sword blows and arrows alike. They rode the finest war horses, each animal worth more than a peasant would earn in a lifetime. They represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology, an armoured aristocracy that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The English, by contrast, were a ragged mob of common soldiers. 2/3 of them were archers, peasants and yeomen armed with simple wooden bows. They had no horses. Many had no armour beyond leather jerkins. They were exhausted, hungry, and suffering from dysentery so severe that some had cut holes in their pants to avoid soiling themselves. By every measure of medieval warfare, they were already dead men. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France and commander of the French army, surveyed the English position from horseback and smiled. He was looking at the complete annihilation of an enemy foolish enough to challenge French military supremacy. By sunset, he would be dead along with 10,000 of his countrymen, and the age of the armoured knight would begin its terminal decline. This is the story of how a 6-foot piece of yew wood and the common men who wielded it shattered 500 years of military doctrine and changed warfare forever. The English longbow that would decide the fate of Agincourt was not a new weapon in 1415. It had been devastating French armies for nearly 80 years, since the beginning of what would later be called the 100 Years' War. At Crécy in 1346, English archers had slaughtered French cavalry. At Poitiers in 1356, they had captured the King of France himself. Yet the French aristocracy, bound by tradition and blinded by class prejudice, had learned nothing from these catastrophes. To understand why requires understanding what the longbow represented, not just as a weapon, but as a social revolution. The medieval world was built on a rigid hierarchy where military power equated to social status. Knights were warriors because they were nobles. Nobles were rulers because they were warriors. The system was self-reinforcing and had been since the fall of Rome. A knight's armour, weapons, and horse represented an investment equal to several years of a skilled craftsman's wages. Only the wealthy could afford to be warriors, and only warriors held political power. Into this ordered world came the longbow, a weapon that cost perhaps a few shillings to make, and could be wielded by any healthy man with sufficient training. Worse, from the aristocratic perspective, it could kill a knight at 200 yards, negating 1,000 pounds worth of armour and breeding and training with a piece of wood any peasant could afford. The French called it an ignoble weapon, unworthy of true warriors. They were horrified that the English would arm commoners and allow them to kill their betters from a distance. It violated everything they believed about the natural order of warfare and society. They would rather die in honourable mounted charges than acknowledge that warfare had changed. At Agincourt, thousands would get their wish. The longbow itself was deceptively simple in appearance. A single stave of yew wood, traditionally harvested from trees grown in the mountains of Spain or Italy, where the slow growth produced dense, elastic wood. The best bows were cut from the boundary layer between heartwood and sapwood, combining the compression strength of the dense heartwood on the belly of the bow with the tensile strength of the elastic sapwood on the back. This created a natural composite that could store and release tremendous energy. A warbow stood roughly 6 feet tall, as high as the men who drew it, and tapered from 2 inches wide at the centre to half an inch at the tips. The draw weight, the force required to pull the string to full draw, ranged from 100 to 180 pounds. For comparison, a modern recreational bow might have a draw weight of 40 to 50 pounds. Drawing a warbow required the strength of the entire body, not just the arms. Archers developed distinctive skeletal deformities from a lifetime of practice, enlarged left arms, twisted spines, and bone spurs where muscles attached to the skeleton. When archaeologists excavated the wreck of the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship that sank in 1545, they found the skeletons of the ship's archers showed these same deformations, physical evidence of the incredible forces involved. Training an archer took years. English law from the reign of Edward III required all able-bodied men to practice archery on Sundays and holidays. Boys began training as young as 7, starting with lighter bows and progressing to full war bows as they developed the necessary strength. By the time an archer went to war, he had spent thousands of hours practicing, developing not just strength, but the muscle memory to achieve consistent accuracy while exhausted, terrified, and under fire. The rate of fire was extraordinary by medieval standards. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute, sustaining this rate for several minutes before fatigue degraded accuracy. Against mass targets like cavalry formations, accuracy requirements were minimal. You weren't aiming at individual knights. You were shooting into a formation 50 yards wide and several ranks deep. At typical engagement ranges of 100 to 200 yards, you couldn't miss. The arrows themselves were purpose-built for war. Each was roughly 30 inches long, fletched with goose feathers to provide stable flight. The shafts were made of ash or birch, selected for straightness and consistency. But it was the arrowhead that made the weapon lethal. English archers at Agincourt carried bodkin points, narrow pyramidal heads designed specifically to penetrate armour. Unlike broadheads designed for hunting, bodkins concentrated all the arrow's kinetic energy into a tiny point, allowing them to slip between the plates of armour or punch through the links of chainmail. The kinetic energy delivered by a longbow arrow was comparable to a modern pistol round. An arrow launched from a 150-pound bow achieved velocities around 180 feet per second and carried roughly 100 joules of energy. When that energy was concentrated into a point a few millimetres across and backed by the momentum of a 2-ounce projectile, the results against human targets were catastrophic. Modern tests using historically accurate reproductions have demonstrated that longbow arrows can penetrate 4 millimetres of steel plate at close range, though armour effectiveness increased dramatically with distance. At 200 yards, most arrows would not penetrate quality plate armour on a direct perpendicular hit. But battles aren't laboratory experiments. Arrows arrived at angles, striking armour at joints and weak points. They hit horses, which were not armoured as heavily as their riders. They struck faces, necks, and the gaps at elbows and knees, and most importantly, they arrived not individually but in volleys, thousands of arrows filling the air simultaneously, creating a probability cloud of death where even heavy armour provided only partial protection. The campaign that led to Agincourt began in August 1415 when King Henry V of England landed in France with an army of roughly 12,000 men. His objective was Harfleur, a fortified port city at the mouth of the Seine that would provide a permanent English foothold in France and a base for future operations. The siege of Harfleur lasted 5 weeks longer than Henry anticipated. The garrison resisted fiercely, and dysentery swept through the English camp. By the time the city surrendered on September 22nd, Henry had lost nearly a third of his army to disease and combat. He garrisoned Harfleur with 200 men and sent another 2,000 sick and wounded back to England. His army now numbered perhaps 6,000 men, and they were deep in hostile territory with winter approaching. The prudent decision would have been to return to England, consolidate his position at Harfleur, and campaign again the following year. Henry chose instead to march to Calais. The English held port 120 miles to the northeast. It was a calculated gesture of defiance, a chevauchée or armed march through enemy territory designed to demonstrate that Henry could move through France unmolested and that the French crown could not protect its subjects. It was also militarily insane. The English army was exhausted, under strength and short on supplies. Moving through France in October meant crossing swollen rivers and marching through mud. The French, humiliated by the fall of Harfleur, were assembling a massive army to intercept and destroy the English invaders. Henry's gamble rested on speed and French disorganisation. If he could reach Calais before the French army assembled, he would achieve a propaganda victory. If the French caught him with his army in its weakened state, the campaign would end in catastrophe, and possibly his own death or capture. The march began on October 8th. The English covered roughly 12 miles per day, slowed by the need to forage for food and the deteriorating condition of the men. Dysentery continued to ravage the ranks. Many soldiers were so weak they could barely march. The army was consuming its own horses for food. On October 13th, the English reached the Somme River, the major geographical obstacle between them and Calais. Henry planned to cross at the tidal ford of Blanchetaque, where Edward III had crossed before the Battle of Crécy 69 years earlier. He arrived to find the ford strongly defended by French forces and the river too deep to cross. The French had been tracking his movements and had garrisoned all the crossing points. For 3 days, Henry marched upstream along the southern bank of the Somme, searching desperately for an undefended ford while the French shadowed him on the opposite bank. His army was disintegrating. Men were collapsing from exhaustion and disease. Food supplies were nearly gone. If the French chose to defend the river in force, the campaign would end without a battle, the English starved into submission or forced to surrender. On October 19th, near Voyenne, English scouts finally found crossing points that were fordable and poorly defended. The army struggled across through water that was chest-deep on the men. By nightfall, the entire force was on the northern bank, but they had been forced 50 miles upstream from their intended crossing point. The detour added days to the march and brought them no closer to safety. The French army, meanwhile, was assembling in the English path. 3 great nobles commanded separate contingents. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, led the royal army. The Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon commanded additional forces. Together, they had perhaps 30,000 men, primarily heavy cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms. They had time, supplies, and overwhelming numerical superiority. All they needed was to position themselves between Henry and Calais and force a battle on ground of their choosing. On October 24th, French scouts reported that they had located the English army near the village of Agincourt, still 50 miles from Calais. The English were exhausted, starving, and had nowhere to run. The French blocked their path with an army 5 times their size. The Battle of Agincourt would happen the following morning, and to the French, the outcome was already decided. October the 25th, 1415 began with rain. The English had spent a miserable night in the open, forbidden to light fires that would reveal their positions and harassed by French cavalry patrols that prevented rest or sleep. Many men were so weakened by dysentery that they could barely stand. They had not eaten a full meal in days. They were, by any objective measure, a beaten army even before the battle began. Henry V addressed his men in the grey pre-dawn light. The speech, immortalised centuries later by Shakespeare, was probably less eloquent in reality, but the message was the same. They would fight, and they would win or die. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no ransom for those who ran. The only path home led through the French army. The position Henry chose for battle was a narrow corridor between 2 woods, the woods of Agincourt to the east and the woods of Tramecourt to the west. The field was roughly 1,000 yards wide at the English position, narrowing to perhaps 750 yards where the French would attack. The ground was freshly ploughed fields, already churned into mud by autumn rain and the passage of the French army the previous day. Henry deployed his army in a single line facing north toward the French position 3/4 of a mile away. In the centre, he placed his dismounted men-at-arms, perhaps 900 knights, and nobles who had given up their horses to fight on foot. This was standard English practice by 1415, a response to the French tactical doctrine of attacking mounted archers. On foot, the English men-at-arms could support the archers and wouldn't be vulnerable to the cavalry charges that had destroyed mounted knights in previous battles. On each flank and interspersed among the men-at-arms, Henry deployed his archers, roughly 5,000 men in formations 4 ranks deep. Each archer carried 48 to 72 arrows in his arrow bag, and supply wagons behind the line held additional sheaves. The total arrow supply was probably in excess of 250,000 projectiles. Before the French could attack, the archers drove sharpened stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a defensive hedge that would break up cavalry charges. These stakes were roughly 6 feet long, sharpened at both ends, driven into the mud at a 45-degree angle pointing toward the French. They couldn't stop determined infantry, but they would impale horses and break the cohesion of a mounted charge. The French position was everything Henry's was not: strong, supplied, and confident. 3 massive formations of dismounted men-at-arms, each several thousand strong, formed the vanguard. These were the finest heavy infantry in Europe, nobles in full plate armour carrying lances, swords, and axes. Behind them, an even larger mounted force of knights waited to exploit the breakthrough once the vanguard shattered the English line. On the flanks, squadrons of mounted men-at-arms prepared to charge the English archers and drive them from the field. The French plan was simple and had worked for centuries. The vanguard would advance and engage the English men-at-arms in melee. The armoured nobles would overwhelm the thin English line through sheer weight of numbers. Simultaneously, the flanking cavalry would charge the archers, forcing them to flee and exposing the English flanks. Then the mounted reserve would charge through the gap and complete the destruction. It was sound tactics based on proven doctrine, and it would have worked perfectly against a conventional medieval army. The English weren't a conventional army. They were an archer army with a corps of heavy infantry for support. The French were about to attack a formation optimized for killing cavalry at range, and they would do it on ground that negated every advantage of armoured horsemen. For several hours, the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. The French were waiting for stragglers to arrive and for the ground to dry somewhat. Henry was waiting because he had no choice. His starving army couldn't manoeuvre, could barely fight, and would disintegrate if forced to remain in position for days. He needed the French to attack, and he needed them to do it soon. Around 11 in the morning, realizing the French were content to wait, Henry made a decision that would define the battle. He ordered his entire army to advance. The archers pulled up their stakes, the formations marched forward 700 yards to within extreme longbow range of the French position, and then the archers replanted their stakes and prepared to shoot. It was an extraordinary gamble. Moving an exhausted army toward an enemy 5 times its size invited disaster. If the French had charged during the advance, the English would have been caught in the open and destroyed. But Henry understood something about his enemy. The French knights, bound by honour and chivalry, would never attack an inferior force that was retreating. But an army that advanced and then deliberately deployed for battle was issuing a challenge that no French noble could ignore without dishonour. The advance was an insult that demanded response. As the English archers replanted their stakes at the new position, now only 250 yards from the French vanguard, Henry gave the order that began the battle. He raised his hand, dropped it, and shouted a single word: shoot. 5,000 longbows released as one with a sound described by chroniclers as being like thunder. The first volley was in the air before the second was drawn. Within 30 seconds, 25,000 arrows had been launched. They climbed in a high arc, seeming to hang in the sky for a moment, before descending like sleet onto the French formations. The French vanguard raised shields and lowered visors, bracing for the impact. Most arrows glanced off armour or embedded in shields, but 25,000 projectiles create a probability field where even low individual hit rates produce mass casualties. Arrows found gaps in armour, struck faces and throats, hit the unarmoured horses of the flanking cavalry. Men fell, horses screamed and bolted, formation cohesion began to dissolve. The French had expected arrow fire. They had armour and shields and discipline. What they hadn't expected was the rate of fire. Before they could process what was happening, another 25,000 arrows arrived, then another, then another. The English archers were maintaining a collective rate of fire of approximately 50,000 arrows per minute. The sky turned dark. The noise of arrows hitting armour was like hail on a metal roof. Horses, driven mad by pain and terror, threw their riders or bolted through friendly formations. The flanking cavalry, the force intended to drive off the English archers, found their charge disrupted before it began. As horses fell or refused to advance through the arrow storm, the cavalry formations compressed and collided with each other. Some squadrons managed to reach the English lines, only to find their horses impaled on the defensive stakes or unable to penetrate the hedge of sharpened wood. Wounded horses crashed into the stakes, creating barriers of screaming, thrashing animals that prevented follow-on waves from closing. The few riders who made it through the stakes found themselves among the archers, who dropped their bows and attacked with swords, axes, and mallets. A mounted knight, isolated among hundreds of infantry and unable to manoeuvre in the mud, was quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, the flanking cavalry was destroyed as an effective force. The survivors retreated in disorder through their own vanguard formations, spreading panic and disrupting cohesion. The French vanguard, still under continuous arrow fire and now with their flanks completely exposed to English archers, had no choice but to advance. Waiting under the arrow storm would result in death without honour. But advancing through freshly ploughed fields churned into liquid mud while wearing 60 pounds of armour was a nightmare. The dismounted knights sank to their ankles with every step. The narrow field compressed the three great formations into an uncontrollable mob. Men stumbled over each other, formations lost all cohesion, and exhaustion set in within minutes. And through it all, the arrows kept coming. 10 arrows per archer per minute. 5,000 archers, 50,000 arrows per minute, 500,000 arrows in the first 10 minutes of combat. The French casualties from arrow fire were heavy but not catastrophic. Most arrows didn't penetrate armour, but they didn't need to. They disrupted formations, killed horses, wounded unarmoured targets, and most importantly exhausted and demoralised the vanguard before it ever reached the English line. By the time the leading French elements closed to contact with the English men-at-arms, they were already beaten. Exhausted from marching through mud, crushed together by the compression of the narrow field, unable to swing their weapons effectively in the press, they were reduced to pushing and shoving rather than fighting. The English men-at-arms, fresh and in good order, met them with lances, swords and axes. But it was the archers who delivered the killing blow. As the French vanguard became locked in melee with the English centre, unable to advance or retreat, the English archers on both flanks stopped shooting into the press of bodies where arrows were as likely to hit friend as foe. Instead, they advanced from their positions, attacked the flanks of the French formation with swords, mallets and axes, and began systematically butchering men who were too exhausted to defend themselves and too compressed to manoeuvre. A French knight in full armour was nearly invulnerable to a peasant with a sword in single combat. But armour became a liability when the wearer was exhausted, trapped in a press of bodies, unable to see or breathe, and attacked by dozens of opponents who struck at joints, visors and weak points. The archers used mallets to crush helmets, swords to stab through vision slits, and knives to find the gaps between armour plates. The slaughter was industrial in scale. Thousands of French nobles who had marched into battle that morning expecting easy victory found themselves being killed by commoners, men they would have dismissed as barely human in any other context. The psychological impact of being butchered by social inferiors was, for the aristocracy, almost as horrific as the physical death. The second French line, seeing the vanguard being destroyed, advanced to support them. They crossed the same muddy field under the same arrow fire and compressed into the same narrow killing ground. They added their weight to the press of bodies but couldn't effectively fight any more than the first line could. They simply piled onto the mass of struggling, dying men and became part of the slaughter. Contemporary chronicles describe the field as being so packed with armoured men that bodies didn't fall when killed, but remained standing, propped up by the press of bodies around them. French nobles at the rear of the formation, unable to advance because of the mass of bodies ahead, unable to retreat because of formations pressing from behind, simply suffocated in their armour. The third French line, the mounted reserve that was supposed to deliver the final blow after the infantry broke the English line, looked at the carnage and chose not to advance. They had watched 2/3 of the French army disappear into the slaughter. They could see that adding more men would only add more corpses. The reserve withdrew, leaving the vanguard and second line to their fate. The fighting lasted perhaps 3 hours, though sources vary. By early afternoon, the English stood victorious on a field carpeted with French dead and wounded. Contemporary estimates suggest 10,000 French casualties, though modern historians consider this somewhat exaggerated. More conservative estimates place French deaths at 6,000 to 7,000, including 3 dukes, 90 other nobles of high rank, and hundreds of knights. The English lost perhaps 400 men, mostly in the initial clashes. Henry himself fought in the melee, and was struck by a French knight's axe that left a permanent dent in his crown. His brother, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded and saved from death by the king's personal intervention. But these were individual actions in a battle decided by industrial killing. The longbow, wielded by common soldiers, had destroyed the flower of French chivalry. The massacre was completed by an atrocity that stained Henry's victory. Late in the battle, a French attack on the English baggage train combined with movements by the French reserve suggested a renewed assault. Henry, fearing his small force would be overwhelmed if the French rallied, gave an order that horrified the nobles on both sides. He commanded that all French prisoners be killed. English men-at-arms, who had been expecting to ransom their noble captives for fortunes, refused to obey. Henry ordered his archers to carry out the executions. The archers, who had no expectation of ransoms and saw the prisoners as enemies who had tried to kill them hours earlier, complied. Hundreds, possibly thousands of French prisoners were killed, many burned alive in buildings where they had been held. The killing only stopped when it became clear the French reserve was withdrawing, not attacking. The slaughter of prisoners violated every code of chivalry and was condemned by chroniclers on both sides. but it reinforced the fundamental lesson of Agincourt that the age of chivalry was ending and that modern warfare would be decided by industrial killing power, not individual honour. The aftermath of Agincourt sent shockwaves through Europe. The French had lost a significant portion of their military leadership and political elite in a single afternoon. The Constable of France was dead. 3 dukes were dead. The Constable of the King's Guard was dead. Over 100 nobles whose ransoms would have funded kingdoms were dead. The survivors faced a reckoning. France had fielded an army 5 times the size of the English force, with superior equipment, on ground they had chosen, and had been annihilated. The English had demonstrated that armoured cavalry, the foundation of medieval warfare for half a millennium, could be defeated by properly deployed infantry armed with missile weapons. This was not a new lesson. The Swiss had been demonstrating it for decades with pike formations. The Scots had used schiltrons of spearmen to defeat English cavalry at Bannockburn. But Agincourt was different in scale and in the forces involved. This was the military elite of France, arguably the most powerful military force in Europe, destroyed by English archers who were predominantly commoners. For the English, victory brought temporary relief but long-term problems. Henry had proven he could defeat any French army in battle, but he lacked the resources to conquer France. He had fewer than 6,000 men left, and was still trapped in enemy territory. The march to Calais resumed immediately after the battle, and the English reached the safety of the port city on October 29th, 4 days after the battle. They had achieved Henry's objective of demonstrating English military superiority, but France remained unconquered and hostile. The prisoners taken at Agincourt, those not killed by Henry's order, represented fortunes in ransoms. The Duke of Orleans, captured during the battle, would remain an English prisoner for 25 years. His ransom negotiations would influence Anglo-French politics for decades. Other nobles were ransomed for sums that enriched individual English soldiers beyond their wildest dreams. A common archer who captured a nobleman could earn more from the ransom than he would make in 10 lifetimes of labour. This created a perverse incentive in medieval warfare where capturing nobles was more profitable than killing them, contributing to the relatively low casualties among nobility in earlier medieval battles. At Agincourt, the English had initially taken thousands of prisoners before Henry's order to execute them. The ransoms lost when those prisoners were killed represented fortunes beyond calculation. But the most significant impact of Agincourt was psychological. The French aristocracy, which had defined itself through military prowess and martial honour for centuries, had been butchered by peasants with wooden bows. The psychological wound cut deeper than the physical casualties. French military doctrine had to change, and it did, but slowly and painfully over the following decades. The lesson seemed obvious: invest in archers, develop missile weapons, stop charging into arrow storms on ground that negated all advantages of heavy cavalry. But medieval social structures resisted these lessons. Arming commoners meant empowering them politically. The English could do it because England's relative poverty and small population meant they had no choice but to mobilise every available man. France, wealthier and more populous, could maintain an aristocratic military elite, until Agincourt proved that elite was obsolete. The French response to Agincourt was complex and contradictory. Some commanders embraced new tactics, using crossbowmen and early firearms, deploying forces in terrain that favoured infantry over cavalry. Others doubled down on traditional methods, arguing that Agincourt was an aberration caused by bad ground and poor leadership, not a fundamental shift in warfare. The debate would continue for decades, settled only when gunpowder weapons made armoured cavalry completely obsolete. The English longbow itself was already approaching obsolescence in 1415, though contemporaries didn't realise it. The weapon required years of training, making it impossible to rapidly expand archer forces. The draw weights required meant only a small percentage of the male population had the strength to wield warbows effectively. And the tactical situation at Agincourt, where an exhausted French army attacked a prepared English position on ground that nullified cavalry advantages, was unlikely to be repeated. In subsequent battles, the French refused to cooperate with English tactical preferences. They avoided frontal assaults on prepared positions, used terrain to negate longbow effectiveness, and employed their own missile troops to suppress English archers. By 1450, France had effectively reversed all English gains from the 100 Years' War, retaking territory that English archers had helped conquer. The true military revolution triggered by Agincourt was not the dominance of the longbow, but the demonstration that common soldiers with missile weapons could defeat armoured elites. This lesson would be reinforced by the development of practical firearms over the following century. A musket required less training than a longbow, could be wielded by anyone regardless of strength, and could penetrate any armour at close range. By 1525, at the Battle of Pavia, arquebusiers would demonstrate that firearms had replaced both the longbow and armoured cavalry as decisive weapons. The social implications were even more profound. Agincourt demonstrated that military power could be divorced from social class. The English archers who shattered French chivalry were not nobles, not even professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were farmers and craftsmen who trained with bows on Sundays and went to war when their king called. They had proven that training and discipline could overcome breeding and armour. This lesson would resonate far beyond the battlefield. If commoners could defeat nobles in war, what other aristocratic privileges might be challenged? The connection between Agincourt and later social changes like the English Civil War or the French Revolution is indirect but real. Once it was proven that common men could defeat their social betters in the ultimate test of medieval life, armed conflict, every other aristocratic claim to superiority became questionable. The longbow itself remained in English service for another century and a half. It was used to devastating effect at other battles, including Verneuil in 1424, where English archers again destroyed a larger French force. But it was gradually replaced by firearms, which offered similar range and penetration, with far less training required. The last major battle where longbows played a decisive role was probably Flodden Field in 1513, where English archers helped destroy a Scottish army. By the time of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the longbow had been completely replaced by muskets in English service. Modern attempts to understand the longbow's effectiveness have combined historical research with practical experiments. Reconstructions of warbows based on examples recovered from the Mary Rose have demonstrated draw weights of 150 to 180 pounds and have achieved the rates of fire claimed in medieval sources. Tests against replica armour have confirmed that bodkin point arrows can penetrate chainmail and even plate armour under certain conditions, particularly at short range or when striking at angles. But these tests also reveal why the longbow ultimately failed as a weapon system. The skill and strength required to achieve rapid, accurate fire with a warbow cannot be developed quickly. Modern archers training with warbows require years to build the necessary strength and technique. In an era of professional armies with rapid mobilization, a weapon requiring such extensive training is impractical. The musket, which could be learned in weeks, was simply more compatible with early modern warfare. Archaeological evidence from Agincourt is limited. The exact location of the battle was lost for centuries, only identified definitively in the 21st century through archaeological survey and analysis of terrain. Excavations have recovered a handful of artifacts including arrowheads. But the systematic stripping of armour and weapons from the battlefield by medieval looters means most physical evidence was removed within days of the battle. The bodies of the French dead were buried in mass graves near the battlefield, but these graves have never been systematically excavated. The most detailed accounts of the battle come from chroniclers on both sides, though these must be read critically. Medieval chronicles were propaganda as much as history, designed to glorify patrons and denigrate enemies. English sources emphasise the desperate heroism of Henry and his men, portraying the battle as a triumph of English virtue over French vice. French sources downplay the defeat, blame it on poor leadership or bad terrain, and skip quickly to later French victories. Modern historians have attempted to reconstruct the battle by comparing multiple sources and applying knowledge of medieval warfare and weapons. The consensus view is that Agincourt was a decisive English victory achieved primarily through tactical advantage and the effective use of longbow fire, but that the scale of French losses was probably exaggerated by contemporary sources. The exact number of casualties will never be known, but even conservative estimates confirm that the French suffered catastrophic losses while English casualties were relatively light. The strategic impact of Agincourt was ultimately limited. Henry V continued his conquest of France, achieving his greatest success at the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which made him heir to the French throne. But he died in 1422, and his infant son Henry VI lacked the ability to hold the English conquests. By 1453, England had lost all its French territories except Calais. The 100 Years' War ended in French victory despite Agincourt and other English battlefield successes. But the tactical revolution begun at Agincourt continued long after the political situation had changed. The lesson that missile weapons wielded by disciplined infantry could defeat armoured cavalry was absorbed by military theorists across Europe. The Spanish tercios, the dominant infantry formation of the 16th century, combined pikemen with arquebusiers in formations designed to deliver both shock and firepower. The Dutch and Swedish armies of the 30 Years' War refined these formations further, creating the linear tactics that would dominate European warfare for 2 centuries. All of these developments trace their lineage back to medieval battles like Agincourt, where infantry proved it could defeat cavalry. The longbow's role in English military and cultural identity became mythical. Englishmen celebrated the longbow as the weapon that had made England great, conveniently forgetting that it had ultimately failed to conquer France and had been abandoned in favour of firearms. The myth of the English archer, the common man whose skill and courage made him the equal of any noble, became central to English self-image. This myth influenced later English history in subtle ways, contributing to the development of parliamentary democracy and resistance to absolute monarchy. If common archers could defeat French nobles, why couldn't common Englishmen have a voice in government? The connection was more cultural than logical, but it was real. The tactical lessons of Agincourt also had limits that contemporaries didn't fully appreciate. The battle succeeded because the French cooperated with English plans by attacking a prepared position on unfavourable ground. In later battles, more cautious French commanders refused to cooperate. At Agincourt itself, if the French had simply surrounded the English position and starved them into submission, Henry's army would have been forced to surrender within days. The food situation was so desperate that the English literally could not afford a prolonged standoff. That the French chose to attack rather than besiege speaks to the cultural and psychological constraints on medieval warfare. Honour demanded battle, not siege. Nobles sought glory in combat, not patient starvation of enemies. These values, which had served the aristocracy for centuries, proved fatal when facing an enemy willing to fight without regard for chivalric norms. The English, operating with fewer resources and less invested in aristocratic values, had greater tactical flexibility. They deployed their forces in whatever way won battles, regardless of whether it was honourable. This pragmatism gave them a decisive advantage at Agincourt and other battles. The French knights charging into arrow fire at Agincourt were not stupid or incompetent. They were prisoners of their own culture, unable to adapt to new tactical realities because doing so would undermine the social order they existed to defend. This is the deeper lesson of Agincourt, that cultural rigidity in the face of technological and tactical change is fatal. The French eventually learned this lesson and reformed their military, but it took decades of defeats and the near destruction of the French kingdom during the darkest days of the 100 Years' War. By the time Joan of Arc appeared in 1429 to rally French resistance, France had developed new tactics and new military organisations that could counter English longbows, but this adaptation came too late for the 10,000 Frenchmen who died at Agincourt. They were casualties not just of English arrows, but of a social system that valued honour over effectiveness and tradition over innovation. Today, Agincourt is remembered primarily through Shakespeare's Henry V, which presents a highly romanticised version of the battle. Shakespeare's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," captures the legend but obscures the reality. The real battle was not a tale of noble brotherhood but of industrial slaughter, where exhausted French knights were systematically butchered in mud by commoners wielding wooden bows and hand weapons. The contrast between Shakespeare's heroic vision and the historical reality reveals how quickly warfare's brutal truths are transformed into comfortable myths. The longbow itself, the weapon that made Agincourt possible, represents a unique moment in military history when human muscle power reached its maximum battlefield effectiveness. The warbow required essentially the entire output of human strength, channeled through optimal mechanical design to achieve lethality against contemporary armour. It was the peak of pre-gunpowder missile technology, and it could never be improved beyond what existed in 1415. The draw weights couldn't be increased because human muscles have biological limits. The arrows couldn't be made more effective without making them heavier, which would reduce range and velocity. The rate of fire was already at the maximum sustainable by trained archers. The weapon had reached its evolutionary dead end, perfected but incapable of further development. This limitation explains why the longbow was so quickly abandoned once firearms became reliable. A musket was heavier, more expensive, less accurate, and had a slower rate of fire than a longbow in 1500. But the musket could be improved. Metallurgy could make barrels stronger, chemistry could improve gunpowder, and engineering could enhance reliability. By 1700, the musket was superior to the longbow in every measurable way. The longbow, by contrast, could not be improved because it had already reached the limits of its design and the biological limits of its users. The social implications of this technological trajectory are profound. The longbow required an egalitarian society that valued and trained common soldiers. Medieval England, relatively poor and with a tradition of yeoman farmers, could sustain this system. But the longbow also required maintaining a large population of trained archers during peacetime, which was expensive and militarily inefficient when those archers weren't at war. The musket, requiring minimal training, allowed armies to rapidly mobilize and demobilize, recruiting soldiers as needed and disbanding them when wars ended. This economic efficiency made the musket preferable even when its battlefield performance was inferior. The tactical implications were equally significant. A formation of longbowmen required careful deployment on favourable terrain with prepared defences. They were vulnerable to cavalry charges if caught in the open, ineffective in siege warfare, and useless in bad weather that dampened bowstrings. Musketeers, by contrast, could fight in any terrain and any weather. They could defend fortifications, conduct sieges, and operate as skirmishers. The tactical flexibility of firearms made them preferable despite their limitations. By 1600, no major European army relied on longbows, and the weapon had become an antiquarian curiosity. The Battle of Agincourt, then, represents both the triumph and the obsolescence of the longbow. It was the weapon's finest hour and also a demonstration of its limitations. The English won decisively, but they won by creating ideal conditions that would never be repeated. The French learned not to attack prepared English positions on muddy ground. Subsequent battles in the 100 Years' War saw far more French caution and far fewer English victories. Agincourt was unique, not replicable, and the lessons drawn from it were limited in their application. Yet the battle's psychological impact far exceeded its strategic importance. The image of common English archers destroying French nobility became central to English national identity. It reinforced narratives about English exceptionalism, about the superiority of English common law and parliamentary government over continental absolutism, about the virtue of the common man versus the corruption of the aristocracy. These narratives, however historically dubious, shaped English and later British culture for centuries. The idea that an ordinary Englishman with a longbow was worth 10 foreign knights became an article of national faith, repeated in countless histories, poems, and plays. This mythology obscures the reality that the longbow's effectiveness was highly contextual and that English archery was not unique. The Welsh had used longbows effectively against English invaders for centuries before the English adopted the weapon. The Scots used similar weapons. Continental armies employed crossbows and later firearms to similar effect. What made Agincourt significant was not the weapon but the circumstances, the terrain, the weather, the exhausted state of both armies, and the French decision to attack under conditions that favoured English tactics. Remove any of these factors, and the outcome might have been completely different. Modern military historians studying Agincourt focus less on the romance of the longbow and more on the fundamentals of medieval logistics and tactics. The English victory was made possible by French logistical and tactical failures as much as by English prowess. The French army, despite overwhelming numerical superiority, failed to concentrate its forces effectively. The vanguard attacked without waiting for the reserve to get into position. The flanking cavalry charges were poorly coordinated with the infantry advance. The French formations were too dense, creating a press of bodies that prevented effective combat. These were failures of command and control, not inevitable consequences of facing longbows. Had the French attacked in successive waves rather than all at once, they might have exhausted the English archers' ammunition supply. Each archer carried perhaps 72 arrows into battle, and resupply from the baggage train would have been slow under combat conditions. A disciplined French attack that maintained formation, accepted casualties from arrow fire, and pressed home once the English had exhausted their ammunition could potentially have succeeded. But this would have required accepting horrific casualties in the initial phases and trusting that subsequent waves would be able to overwhelm the English once their primary weapon was neutralised. The French nobility, fighting for personal glory rather than collective victory, couldn't sustain that level of discipline and sacrifice. The contrast between medieval and modern warfare is stark at Agincourt. Medieval armies were collections of individuals seeking personal honour and glory. Coordination was minimal, command and control primitive, and tactical doctrine focused on individual prowess rather than collective action. Modern armies, even in the 15th century, were beginning to emphasise discipline, coordination, and the subordination of individual glory to collective effectiveness. The English at Agincourt, fighting defensively from prepared positions under centralised command, represented a more modern approach. The French, charging forward in search of personal glory, represented the older medieval tradition. The battle was as much a contest between these two philosophies of warfare as between longbows and armour. This philosophical dimension of Agincourt is often overlooked, but is crucial to understanding why the battle mattered. The defeat of French chivalry was not just a military setback, but a cultural crisis. The aristocracy defined itself through martial valour and personal prowess in combat. When that prowess proved insufficient against disciplined commoners with missile weapons, the entire basis of aristocratic identity was called into question. If nobles couldn't win battles through superior courage and equipment, what justified their social privileges? The question was not answered at Agincourt, but it was posed with brutal clarity. The English archers who killed French knights were themselves transformed by the experience. Many became wealthy from ransoms and plunder. They returned to England as heroes, celebrated in their villages and elevated in status. Some used their earnings to purchase land, rising from the peasantry into the yeoman class or even the minor gentry. This social mobility, unthinkable in France, was common in England and was directly tied to the military effectiveness of common soldiers. The longbow, by making commoners militarily valuable, made them socially valuable as well. The connection between military service and political rights, which would become central to later democratic developments, was forged in battles like Agincourt. The French response to this English social model was to reject it entirely. The French aristocracy, even after Agincourt, refused to arm common soldiers en masse or to treat military effectiveness as more important than social hierarchy. This decision had long-term consequences. France remained more aristocratic, more hierarchical, and more resistant to social change than England. When revolution came to France in 1789, it came violently, driven by centuries of accumulated resentment against an aristocracy that had refused to adapt to changing circumstances. The seeds of that revolution were planted in part on the muddy fields of Agincourt, where French nobles chose death with honour over adaptation and survival. The military lessons of Agincourt were clear to contemporaries but difficult to implement. Every commander knew that missile weapons were effective against cavalry, and that terrain and weather could negate the advantages of heavy armour. But translating this knowledge into institutional change required overcoming powerful vested interests. The aristocracy had invested fortunes in armour, horses, and training. Admitting that this investment was obsolete meant accepting impoverishment and loss of status. Military reform threatened not just individual careers but entire social classes. The resistance to change was not stupidity but rational self-interest by those who had the most to lose. This pattern would repeat throughout military history. Every revolutionary weapon or tactic faces resistance from those invested in the existing system. The machine gun, the tank, the airplane, and nuclear weapons all face skepticism and resistance from military establishments committed to older ways of war. Agincourt was an early example of this dynamic, where tactical innovation defeated traditional methods, and where the losers' resistance to learning from defeat perpetuated their losses. The French eventually adapted, but it took decades and near-catastrophic defeat before change became possible. The longbow's place in this history is both central and paradoxical. It was a revolutionary weapon that didn't fundamentally change warfare. It was devastatingly effective under specific conditions but useless under others. It required social and political systems that could support mass training of commoners, but was ultimately replaced by weapons that required no such training. It represented both the peak of pre-industrial military technology and the beginning of its obsolescence. Agincourt was the longbow's greatest triumph, and also a demonstration of why the weapon would soon be abandoned. The archers who fought at Agincourt could not have understood this paradox. They knew only that they had defeated a vastly superior enemy force and survived when survival seemed impossible. They had marched 260 miles through enemy territory, starving and sick, and had destroyed the finest army in Europe in a single afternoon. For them, it was validation of English superiority and proof that their king had God's favour. The strategic complexities, the tactical circumstances, the social implications, none of this mattered to men who had faced death and won. They had their victory, and it was enough. King Henry V understood more. He recognised that Agincourt, while militarily significant, had not achieved his strategic objectives. France was still hostile, still powerful, and still capable of raising new armies. The death of 10,000 French nobles was a tragedy for France, but not a decisive blow. France had population and resources that England could never match. One battle, however spectacular, could not determine the outcome of a war that had already lasted 78 years and would continue for another 38. Henry needed to convert battlefield success into political settlement, which he pursued through the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. But even that treaty, which made him heir to the French throne, proved ephemeral. His death in 1422 and the subsequent collapse of English holdings in France demonstrated that military victories, however impressive, cannot substitute for strategic sustainability. The French nobles who died at Agincourt left widows, orphans, and massive debts. The ransoms that might have been paid for their release instead went unpaid, impoverishing their families and creditors. The political chaos in France, exacerbated by the loss of so many leaders in a single day, contributed to civil war between Armagnac and Burgundian factions. This civil war, in turn, enabled further English conquests. Agincourt's consequences rippled through French society for decades, destabilising the kingdom and prolonging the war that had caused the battle in the first place. The 10,000 dead were not just casualties of war, but catalysts for further conflict. The Battle of Agincourt stands as one of history's most studied military engagements precisely because it encapsulates so many larger themes. It was a clash of old and new, of cavalry and infantry, of aristocracy and commons, of tradition and innovation. It demonstrated that numerical superiority, superior equipment, and favourable strategic position could all be negated by tactical competence and advantageous terrain. It showed that cultural values could be as important as weapons technology in determining battlefield outcomes, and it proved that even decisive victories have limited strategic value without the resources to exploit them. For the longbow, Agincourt was both apotheosis and epitaph. The weapon would never again achieve such a dramatic success. English armies would continue to employ archers for another century, but never again would they face an enemy so cooperative as to attack under ideal conditions for archery. The French learned, other enemies learned, and the tactical circumstances that made Agincourt possible never recurred. Within a century, the longbow had been relegated to hunting and sport, replaced on battlefields by weapons that required less skill but offered greater tactical flexibility. The men who drew those longbows at Agincourt, the 5,000 archers whose names history has forgotten, were the true protagonists of the battle. They were not heroes in the chivalric sense, they did not seek glory or honour. They were common soldiers who wanted to survive, go home, and perhaps profit from the campaign. Their weapon was not noble or romantic, but was simply effective. They killed from a distance, without honour, without mercy, and without hesitation. They butchered nobles who considered them barely human, and they felt no guilt because the nobles would have killed them just as readily. They were modern soldiers fighting in a medieval world, and their victory at Agincourt announced that the medieval world was ending. The transformation was not immediate or obvious. Knights in armour would continue to dominate battlefields for another century. But the trend was irreversible. At Agincourt, common men with simple weapons had defeated the military elite of Europe. The lesson could not be unlearned. Warfare was becoming democratized, made accessible to anyone who could be trained and equipped rather than reserved for a hereditary warrior caste. This democratization of violence would have profound consequences, leading eventually to mass armies, total war, and the modern nation-state built on universal military service. The path from Agincourt to the trenches of the Somme is long but traceable, and it begins with archers in muddy fields, demonstrating that war was no longer the exclusive province of the aristocracy. The English longbow, that simple 6-foot stave of yew wood, was the instrument of this transformation. It required no rare materials, no complex manufacturing, and no expensive infrastructure. Any healthy man could learn to use it with sufficient practice. It made lethal force available to the common man, and in doing so, it changed the world. At Agincourt, those common men stood in muddy fields and killed nobles by the thousands, and the age of chivalry began to die. The longbow did not fire the final shot in that long death. Firearms would do that, but it fired some of the most devastating volleys. And on October 25th, 1415, in the narrow fields between two woods in northern France, those volleys announced that the future belonged not to the armoured knight, but to the common soldier, and that warfare would never be the same again.